Welcome to Vietnam Legal and Investment Insights.
Glad to be here.
Our deep dive today, it's all about shareholder rights here in Vietnam.
Yeah.
We're going to be focusing on a particularly tricky situation. What happens when a company decides to delist from the stock exchange?
Right.
We're pulling our insights from a recent article on the Harley Miller law firm website.
Okay.
It's a great resource for foreign investors like you. Imagine you put your hard-earned money into a Vietnamese company, and suddenly they announce they're delisting.
It happens.
What happens next?
Yeah. What are your rights? That's what we're going to cover today.
What can you actually do? A lot of people might feel powerless in that situation, but Vietnamese law actually has some pretty strong protections for shareholders.
It does. Even if you're not a Vietnamese citizen, you still have rights.
That's great to hear. So let's start with the basics. What are some of the fundamental rights that every shareholder has, no matter how many shares they own?
Well, every shareholder has the right to go to shareholder meetings and vote on big decisions that the company makes.
Okay, that makes sense.
You also have the right to receive dividends
Right.
when those are given out.
Okay, so far so good. Those sound pretty standard, like shareholder rights in many other places, around the world.
Right.
What about selling shares? Can you just do that whenever you want?
You can. Vietnamese law gives you the right to transfer your shares.
Okay,
And that means you can sell them if you like.
that's good. And what about access to company information?
Yeah, that's important. You have a right to look at certain documents, like the company's charter, the minutes from meetings, and the financial reports.
Okay, so transparency is built into the system.
It is.
That's great. Now, the article mentions something called exclusive rights for shareholders who own a larger chunk of the company. What does that mean?
Yeah, so if you own a lot of shares, you get some extra benefits. You can access even more company documents, like the minutes from board meetings. And here's a big one. You can actually ask for a legal audit by the company's supervisory board
Whoa.
if you think something shady is going on.
Hold on. So if a shareholder suspects there's mismanagement or even fraud, they can just trigger an investigation.
Basically, yeah. It's a powerful tool to hold the company accountable.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm starting to see why it's so important to understand these rights.
Right.
Now, let's get into this whole delisting scenario. What exactly happens when a company decides to pull out of the Vietnamese stock exchange?
Well, the first thing to know is that it's not a decision the company can just make on its own.
Okay.
The shareholders have to vote on it.
So it's not a done deal the moment the company announces it.
Not at all.
Okay. So shareholders have a say in this process.
They do.
What if a shareholder thinks it's a bad idea to delist? Can they try to stop it?
Absolutely. You have the right to fight the decision. You can even escalate it to the authorities if you have serious concerns.
Wow.
And the law has your back. You've got the securities law, the stock exchange rules, and even the company's own charter, all working together to protect you.
Okay, so there's a whole legal framework in place.
There is.
Can you give us some examples of
Yeah.
how these laws actually play out in the real world?
Sure. Let's say there are rumors of, market manipulation just before a company announces its delisting.
Okay.
Well, the securities law is designed to prevent that kind of thing.
Okay.
It allows for investigations and penalties if someone's trying to take advantage of the situation
Right.
to hurt other shareholders.
Yeah, that's crucial. Let's get even more specific.
Okay.
The article mentioned some safeguards during the delisting process.
Right.
What are those? What's stopping a company from just, running off with investors' money?
Well, one of the biggest protections is transparency. Companies have to be very clear about why they're delisting and what's going to happen to the shares after they leave the exchange.
Okay.
They can't just disappear with your money.
That's good. So at least investors have the information they need to make informed decisions.
Right.
What else is there to protect shareholders during this process?
Well, if you are a shareholder and you're worried about the delisting, you can ask the company's supervisory board to take a look.
Okay, so this independent board, it acts like a watchdog, making sure that everything's fair, especially for the shareholders who might not have a ton of influence.
Exactly.
Are there any other safeguards we should know about?
Yeah, if enough shareholders are concerned, they can actually call a special meeting
Okay.
to challenge the company directly on the delisting.
Wow, so they really do have a voice.
They do.
That's good to know. And then, what about the value of the shares themselves?
Right. So Vietnamese law actually sets some standards for how much a company has to pay shareholders
Okay.
if they're buying back shares because of the delisting.
Okay, so there's some protection there as well.
That there is.
All right. So It sounds like there's quite a bit of protection built into the system,
Right.
but what happens if, things go wrong?
Right.
What if a shareholder feels like, hey, my rights have been violated? What can they actually do?
Well, you have a few options, both within the company and externally.
Okay.
We can dive into those.
Yeah, let's hear it. What can a shareholder do if they feel like they've been wronged during this whole delisting process?
Well, you can always start by talking to the company directly,
Okay.
raising your concerns, explaining why you're unhappy.
Right.
You can also reach out to the supervisory board, make your case to them, and ask them to review the decision.
So it's best to try to work things out internally first.
It is.
But, what if that doesn't work?
Well, then you can escalate it.
Got
You can go to the State Securities Commission. That's the government agency that oversees the stock market here.
Right.
They can investigate, and they can take action if the company has broken the rules.
And, in a worst-case scenario, can a shareholder actually sue?
You can. If you've tried everything else and you believe your rights have really been violated, you can file a lawsuit.
Okay.
But, going to court can be expensive and it can take a long time.
Yeah, that's good advice. Sometimes it's better to try to find a solution outside of the courtroom. But it's good to know that that's an option, though.
It is.
Okay, so let's break down a real-world scenario here.
Okay.
Imagine you have a big shareholder, someone who has a lot of control over the company, and they're trying to use the delisting process to their advantage.
I see where you're going with this.
Maybe they want to buy out the smaller shareholders for a really low price, hoping to take the company private or, relist it later at a much higher price.
Right. Trying to pull a fast one.
Exactly.
But the mechanisms we talked about can actually prevent that.
Oh, good.
If the smaller shareholders know their rights, they can fight back. They can demand an investigation, they can challenge the delisting at a meeting, or even go to the State Securities Commission.
It's encouraging to know that there are ways to push back against these kinds of tactics.
Yeah.
So even though delisting might seem really scary at first, Vietnam actually has some strong legal tools in place to protect shareholders, especially if you know what you're entitled to.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power in situations like this.
What about you? What stood out to you the most from this article on shareholder rights?
What impressed me was how much the law focuses on protecting all shareholders, not just the ones with the most money or the loudest voices.
Right.
It's a system that really encourages transparency.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like Vietnam has found a good way to balance protecting investors and also creating a healthy business environment. And, if you're out there and you're looking for expert guidance on this stuff, navigating the complexities of Vietnamese law, protecting your investments, Harley Miller Law Firm is here to help. Absolutely. We have a team of really experienced lawyers who know this area inside and out. We're always here to answer your questions. You can find us on the web. We've got contact info, resources, all that good stuff.
Perfect. We've only scratched the surface today, but hopefully, this deep dive has given you a better understanding of shareholder rights in Vietnam and what to do if you're ever facing a company delisting.
Exactly. Knowing your rights can really make a difference.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this first part, I want to leave you with something to think about. We focused on the legal side of delisting, but there are also, ethical considerations. Is delisting always the right move for a company, thinking about all the stakeholders?
Yeah.
Could it actually harm the business or even the market as a whole in some situations? Something to ponder.
That's a really good point. It's important to look beyond just the legalities and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, and we'll dig into that more, the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
We'll be back with more. Yeah, it really is. It's a complex issue with a lot of gray areas, but definitely something to think about.
Yeah, and it just highlights how important it is to have, a trusted legal partner like Harley Miller Law Firm by your side when you're dealing with all these complex issues. Vietnamese corporate law can be tricky.
It can. We can help investors understand not only their rights, but, the whole Vietnamese business landscape and make sure they're doing things the right way, ethically and strategically.
Right. Okay, so let's get back to those safeguards, those concrete safeguards for shareholders during a delisting. We talked about transparency, the supervisory board, but what else is there to keep those companies honest?
Well, one key thing is that companies have to have a clear delisting plan, a comprehensive plan.
Okay.
And this plan has to explain exactly what's going to happen to those shares, how they're going to buy them back, what the price will be, and the timeline for everything.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It gives shareholders a roadmap, some peace of mind knowing what to expect.
Exactly. And Vietnamese law goes even further. It actually sets some guidelines for how that repurchase price is determined. It's not just up to the company to decide whatever they want. There are legal standards to ensure that the valuation is fair.
Okay, that's good to hear, especially for shareholders who might not have the same bargaining power as the big investors.
Yeah.
But what about the stock exchange itself? Do they have any say in all of this?
Oh, yeah. The stock exchange has its own rules and regulations,
Okay.
and they can really scrutinize these delisting applications. They want to make sure that everything is above board.
Okay.
They can step in if they see anything suspicious, any potential violations of shareholder rights.
It sounds like there's a lot of oversight involved.
There is.
But let's take a step back for a second and talk about the bigger picture here.
Mm.
Why would a company in Vietnam want to delist from the stock exchange in the first place?
Well, there are a few different reasons. Sometimes it's a strategic move. Maybe they want to simplify their operations or gain more control over the company. Or sometimes it's to prepare for, a merger or acquisition.
Right. I can see how those could be legitimate business reasons.
Yeah, but sometimes the motives might not be so clear-cut.
Oh,
A company might want to delist to avoid all the scrutiny and the rules that come with being publicly traded.
right.
Or like we discussed earlier, they might be trying to, gain an advantage over certain shareholders.
Yeah, that's where it gets a little shady. It's important for investors to really do their homework,
Yeah,
understand what's going on.
exactly. If you're not comfortable with the company's explanation for delisting, if you think there might be something else going on, well, that's a red flag.
Yeah, it's definitely a good time to reach out to some legal experts, like the team at Harley Miller.
For sure.
We can help you figure out what's going on and if your rights are being protected.
Exactly. We have the experience to guide you through the process and make sure you're making the best decisions.
So let's do a quick recap. We've learned that shareholder rights in Vietnam, especially during a delisting, are actually pretty strong.
They are.
There are laws, regulations, safeguards, all sorts of things in place to protect your investment.
But you got to be proactive, got to stay informed, and if you need to, seek professional advice.
Absolutely. And don't forget about the power of collective action.
Right.
If you think something's not right, chances are other shareholders feel the same way. Working together, you can make your voices heard and increase the chances of a fair outcome.
Solidarity is a powerful thing.
It is. Okay, so let's say you're a shareholder and you're not happy with the delisting decision. What are the concrete steps you can take to challenge it?
Well, as we talked about before, you have options both within the company and externally.
Okay.
So internally, you can start by talking to the company's management, send them a letter outlining your concerns. You could also request a meeting with the supervisory board, present your case, and ask them to take a look at the decision.
So it's always a good idea to try to resolve things internally first.
It is, but if that doesn't work, then you can take it to the next level.
What does that look like?
You can file a complaint with the State Securities Commission. Give them any evidence you have of wrongdoing or any violations of shareholder rights. They have the power to investigate and take action if the company is not following the rules.
Oh, okay. So they have some real teeth.
They do.
What about going to court? Is that a possibility for shareholders?
It is. If you've tried everything else and you truly believe your rights have been violated, you can file a lawsuit. But, lawsuits can be costly and they can drag on for a while.
Yeah, that's good advice. Sometimes it's better to find a solution outside of the courtroom,
Right.
but it's good to know that that's an option if all else fails.
It is a last resort. But sometimes it's necessary to protect your rights.
Okay, so we've talked about all the different steps a shareholder can take. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about understanding the company's motivations for delisting. What are some red flags that investors should look out for?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is a lack of transparency. If the company is being vague about why they're delisting or they refuse to provide details about the process, well, that's not a good sign.
Okay. What else should investors be wary of?
Another thing to watch out for is a big gap between what the company is offering to buy back your shares for and what those shares are actually worth on the market. If the price seems way too low, that's a red flag.
Yeah, it could mean they're trying to take advantage of the situation.
Right. It's always a good idea to do your own research, Maybe even get an independent valuation, just to make sure you're getting a fair deal.
And if you're unsure about anything, talking to legal experts like the team at Harley Miller can really help.
Definitely. They can give you the guidance you need to make smart decisions.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the big picture. What are some of the potential pros and cons of delisting, both for companies and investors?
Sure. So from the company's perspective, delisting can have some advantages. It can save the money and reduce some of the hassle of being publicly traded.
Okay. So,
Well, they don't have to file as many reports with regulators.
right.
They don't have to deal with as much scrutiny from analysts and investors.
Makes sense. And it gives them more flexibility in decision making.
Exactly. They're not as beholden to the whims of the market.
I can see how that might be appealing, especially for smaller companies or companies with a very long-term outlook.
Right. But there are also some downsides to delisting.
Like what?
Well, it can make it harder for them to raise money in the future.
Because they're not on the stock exchange anymore.
Exactly. Investors might be less willing to put money into a private company.
Right.
And it can also hurt their ability to attract and retain top talent
Why is that?
because they can't offer stock options, which are a big draw for many employees.
That's a good point. So there's definitely a trade-off there.
Uh,
What about for investors? What are the pros and cons for them?
well, it really depends on the specific situation. If the company is doing well and has a solid plan for the future, delisting could actually be good for investors
How?
because they might see bigger returns in the long run without the pressure of the public markets.
Interesting. But I imagine there are also some risks.
Yeah. For example, it can be harder to sell your shares if you need to because there's no longer a public market for them.
Right. And it can be tougher to keep tabs on how the company is doing since they're not required to disclose as much information.
Exactly. So it's a bit of a gamble.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
So what can investors do to protect themselves during a delisting?
Well, the most important thing is to stay informed. Keep up with company announcements, read their financial reports, and if possible, go to shareholder meetings.
So knowledge is power.
It really is. And don't be afraid to ask questions. If something doesn't make sense or you're worried about something, reach out to the company or talk to a financial advisor or a legal expert like those at Harley Miller Law Firm.
They can help you understand the situation and make the best decisions.
For sure.
Okay, so to wrap things up, delisting can be a complex and sometimes confusing process, but it's not something to be afraid of. By understanding your rights, staying informed, and seeking expert advice when you need it, you can navigate this process effectively and protect your investments.
Yeah, exactly. Preparation is key.
Well said. All right, that's it for our deep dives into shareholder rights and delisting in Vietnam. We hope you found this discussion helpful.
We did our best to break down this complex topic and give you the information you need to make informed decisions.
And remember, if you're ever facing a delisting or have any questions about investing in Vietnam, don't hesitate to reach out to Harley Miller Law Firm. We're here to help.
We're passionate about making sure foreign investors have the knowledge and support they need to succeed in the Vietnamese market.
Thanks for tuning in to Vietnam Legal and Investment Insights.
Until next time.
Invest wisely.